Documentation, which is, of course, everybody's favorite thing in the world, comes in two flavors for software development at a very high level. First, you've got system documentation that's really focused on programmers as the primary audience, right? Internal stakeholders who need to understand the nitty-gritty details of how the system was built and put together. Then you also have user documentation, which is really focused on external stakeholders. This can be either marketing as a sales pitch or user documentation to help actual users of the system understand the system. But those are the two high-level branches. And if you're developing any kind of a software system that is small or open source or in some ways a mix where your stakeholders are both users and developers, then you may see blurred lines between this. I think it's most common in an open source environment where the user documentation is kind of assuming a programmer or somebody who's got some technical acumen to begin with. And that makes it a little bit easier for you to get bang for your buck when you're doing documentation for open source software systems. That said, there are still other ways that you could break this stuff down even further than just this high-level dichotomy by focusing on particular kinds of documentation. Now, most of these are for user documentation, but you could also do this sort of thing to some detail on system documentation. First, you could come up with a reference document that's really explaining how to use a particular feature within the system in absence of any other documentation for the rest of the system. You might think of this as like a user manual for a particular feature. I don't know, I guess maybe a good example would be something like an online video showing you how to send an email, or all of the different things that you can do in the compose elements of an email client. Right? A larger email client is going to do more than just allow you to send email, but one of the things that it will have is a feature for sending emails, and inside of that there's lots of other sub-features that may need particular highlighting or reference documentation. Another kind of documentation would be a procedural manager, procedure manual. So it's taking a business task from start to finish and showing you how you would do it with a particular tool. So something like this in the context of an email client would be setting up workflows so that you can respond to common requests from customers or common requests from people you work with in a quick and efficient fashion, right? So that could include setting up the filter, finding new mail in the filter, responding to emails in that filter, cleaning out the filter so that you no longer have things that look like they're pending but when they're really not pending. That sort of stuff. And then finally, you might have a complete system tutorial that's just walking somebody through every major component of the system, describing in detail how you'd want to use all of them. So you can kind of think of these as increasing in terms of scope and complexity. This is one specific feature, this is one business task, and this is anything you might ever want to do with the system from top to bottom increase. And then documentation itself. I think this is the part that a lot of people in software development do not realize the value of, simply because software development is a little bit of a self-selecting profession. Many of the people who are in that profession got into it in part because they didn't like reading Pride and Prejudice in the high school, or they didn't like reading history books, or some of the more liberal arts oriented things. They were interested in science and mathematics, and computing fell naturally to them. But writing and documentation needs to be designed with the same level of seriousness that source code needs to be designed, right? Nobody actually wants to read documentation. The vast majority of stuff that people end up reading in their lives are things that they just don't want to read. How do you file your taxes? What is the procedure for operating a lawnmower? Things like that. No one really cares to read that sort of stuff. It's not fun. It's not, the latest and greatest fiction. And it needs to be designed so that people can get what they need to from it, even in that circumstance, even understanding that nobody really wants to be referring to this sort of stuff. So that means you want features that allow people to skim or find elements of the documentation that are valuable to them really quickly. That can include a table of contents. It can include a specific index, a feature index. Search features on the tools for the documentation. Now, a lot of documentation is a living thing. It's like a web application more than it is a book. And so you can have search features or highlighting features. You might have summaries within the documentation so that you don't have to read through, a long chapter. You could just read a couple of paragraphs and get the sense of whether or not that chapter will include an answer to the questions you might have, and other navigation elements that may be useful in technical documentation. So the high-level picture, though, is all of this support stuff is really necessary primarily because nobody was going to pick up a large manual to a piece of software and just read it cover to cover like it was a novel, right? This is not Harry Potter. It's probably much more boring than that if you were to try and read it from cover to cover. So we have to design the documentation around that basic premise. And technical writing, the last piece that I wanted to talk about in documentation. High quality communication is absolutely critical to software development. Pardon me. And designing documentation is something that literally is an entire degree program on its own. Technical writers have entire course programs set out for them so that they can figure out what are the kinds of errors that people make, what are the sorts of communications that help answer the questions that people run into, particularly in technical tasks. And I'm not going to be able to cover any of that in the kind of detail that it really deserves. But I kind of think that if you understand the point, right, if you're willing to stipulate, okay, technical writing is absolutely critical, if that's all I know about it, what should I do? Essentially, if you do not have any of these sub-bullets here, you're probably doing it wrong, right? Your organization is probably making a big mistake or leaving a lot of value on the table. You should have communication with diagrams, videos, and other media, right? These are very, very valuable tools to help people understand what's going on in a way that pure written language won't, especially for technical topics, many of which need to be visualized in ways that are hard to do with just natural language. Consistency with other software artifacts, meaning if you do not have a process in place to make sure your documentation is always kept up to date with other software artifacts that could include the diagrams, the source code, the tests, all of the other software artifacts, then people will stop trusting the documentation, right? The first time you find an error where the documentation says one thing and the source code says another, you're going to stop trusting the documentation because you have to trust the source code, right? The source code is what it is. You can't really ignore that, but you can, to your own detriment most of the time, ignore the documentation. So make sure there's a process for ensuring some kind of consistency between the two. You also need a person or role with clear communication as their primary responsibility on your team. This is probably true even in organizations as small as like 7 or 8. Right? Somebody has to take ownership of communication and technical writing and the documentation as a primary responsibility of their job. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It's going to get ignored. It's not going to be the high quality that you're going to need when push comes to shove. And then finally, if you do not have documentation, technical writing as an explicit part of the implementation process, right, the process where you're building source code, then it's not going to be a first-class citizen. Right? That should include updating or creating brand new documentation, but it has to happen concurrently with the source code itself. It's very, very difficult to, after the fact, go back and figure out all of the things that should have been documented at the end of a project. For one, there's very little impetus at that point to have somebody really dive into the weeds for all of this stuff. And then for a second point, you're actually not going to get the kind of benefit out of the documentation at that point, because one of the main things that you get by having to document all of this stuff up front is it serves as a check on quality of the source code itself, right? If it's hard to document, if it's hard to describe in a clear way, even when you have talented communicators trying to describe it that way, then the implementation itself could be problematic. You can almost think of technical writing as if it were a test that you're trying to ensure your system can pass, right? If you have the ability to write about this clearly and concisely, then the source code is good. And if you don't have the ability to write about it clearly and concisely, then it may just be bad. It might be bad source code. And that can serve a lot of functions in an organization.